At about 9:35 p.m., we received a radio call. A child was believed to have been abducted. It ended badly.
This person, this phantom, has come and taken a child and done something horrific to them, and we don't know who they are.
You would have some very good leads.
This guy is a good suspect.
They lived in the neighborhood, they knew the family.
We got his DNA. That was submitted to the forensic science people.
They had criminal records of sexual assault and kidnapping.
And the results didn't come back, there was no match.
We eliminated at least 50 to 60 people by DNA. It was dead end after dead end after dead end.
They never forgot. That was the thing. They never forgot that little girl.
Welcome to Crime Beat. I'm Anthony Robart. Tonight, it was a community known for its unlocked doors and kids playing in the streets until all hours. But the calm of one warm spring evening in 1971 is shattered with the feared abduction of a 6-year-old girl, an unprecedented event that forever changed the city. Here now is a million dead ends.
Windsor, Ontario is at that time, a city of about 200,000 people. It's a border city because it sits right on the Detroit River. It's a working class city. The automotive industry at the time was very large.
We're the motor city of Canada. We had the big three here for many years. There's a lot of factories that support what the big three do. And because of the amount of employment that the big three were offering, it was a big immigration point in the city. So you get this influx of people from all sorts of different backgrounds working blue-collar jobs, coming to Canada to make a better life for themselves.
It was not unlike a lot of other places in the country, but where we're located made it a dead end in Ontario. So it was a transient type of city. You know, things filtered in, but to filter out, they had to go back the same way. It's not a city that they stopped in on the way somewhere else.
It was a quiet town, you know, very little action going on, you know. I think back then, I think our murder rate was like 1 or 2 a year, if that. Low crime, you know, very nice, peaceful city.
May the 14th, 1971, we were working the afternoon shift in the Drouillard Road area.
Drouillard Road, it's kind of east central Windsor. It's coming up now, but it was always kind of a rough and tumble neighborhood even back then, known as Ford City.
This area that I worked, it at the time was called Number 8 District. It still looks the same as it ever did. There were a lot of hotels, bars. This used to be on here. The type of calls that we would get down here: bar fights, drinking complaints, assaults, car accidents, just kind of the run of the mill. In May of 1971, my partner and I were working in a patrol car in the Drouillard Road area. It wasn't a really busy evening. At about 9:35 p.m., we received a radio call to attend an address on Drouillard Road where a child was believed to have been abducted. I had only been on the police force for 5 years, so for the number of calls that I had taken, it was an unusual call. We were a little bit away, a few minutes getting down here. 1290 was a little house on the right-hand side down here that is no longer there, but it was just right here at this corner. When we got to the address, we went to the door, and we were met by the mother, who was frantic. Mrs. Topic, her first name was Paula, explained that her daughter, who was 6 years old, and her brother, who was 8, were playing in the backyard when they were approached by a strange man. The stranger offered the little girl $8 if she would walk with him down Drouillard Road a little bit, and he gave her brother a dime, and the little girl left with the man. The brother went right into the house. He went straight into the house and told his mother what had happened.
Paul is there with a friend, and he explains that he sees them walking towards Seminole Road on Drouillard Road. I'm not sure how quickly he went into the house at the time to relay that information, and then that's when Paul and her friend go out looking for Ljubica.
She was described as 6 years of age, approximately 4 feet tall, blonde hair, wearing a pink blouse, and green and yellow slacks. The mother was visibly upset, so we knew that we had to treat this very gently, but we also knew that it was quite serious. We had to get something going. Real quickly, we checked the house, made sure that the little girl wasn't there, hadn't come back. No, she wasn't there. The mother couldn't tell us anything about the person that walked away with the daughter because she didn't see him. So everything that we did get came from the boy. Although because of his age, it was difficult to really get a lot. But the person was described as a male, white, early 20s, tall and slim, wearing dark clothing. When we left the house, I said to my partner, I said, you know, if we don't find this little girl in an hour, we have a big problem. We got a hold of our radio dispatcher and gave a description of the child and the man that was with her, and had more cars sent to the area to start looking for her.
The night she went missing, it was like the largest manhunt in Windsor history. Like hundreds of people, volunteers, police, scoured the streets together, looking in alleys and streets and parks.
Looking back in time, you need some historical context. So in 1971, we still had call boxes in the city of Windsor. So communications to police from dispatch were drastically different. So they get to the Topic residence around 9 o'clock. Sometime prior to that, Michael, Ljubica's older brother, had come in and said that somebody had offered him a dime and promised to pay Ljubica some money to come do a job. There's a separation there. How much of a delay before police response gets into the area, right? And it's no fault of anybody's, it's 1971. Child abduction wasn't a thing. So Paula's first thing that she does with her friend is she takes a walk down to Seminole Street, which is about a half kilometer away, and then comes back and then calls the police.
We attended the residence at 9:35, so the call would have been just a few minutes earlier than that. The little girl was last seen at approximately 9 o'clock. By 9:50, we had a description of both the little girl and the abductor that we put out on the radio.
And then you have the whole dispatch procedure where it's not instantaneous to your computer in your car. It's a more tedious process, and then officers start to get to the area. It floods in fast. A lot of officers do. Even citizens start to come in and help what they called house-to-house checks. We're looking for this girl. We're trying to find her.
We went up and down alleys, streets right in that immediate area looking for this duo. We had lots of eyes on the road. There would have been at least 5 district cars, units from the downtown precinct, and we also had detective cars. There was a lot of people there. At midnight, one of the lieutenants arranged a proper grid search, and my partner and I ended up being sent to the Essex Terminal Railroad, and it was open for people to walk down that way, so it was quite common to see people taking shortcuts going down the tracks. A lot of the people involved were fathers, and there was an urgency for us to try and find her.
Welcome back. On May 14th, 1971, little Ljubica Topic is out playing with her brother and some friends when a stranger lures her away just after 9 p.m. A massive search begins. Hundreds of police and citizens scour the streets. Eventually, they find her 4 hours later. We now return to a million dead ends.
So at 1 o'clock in the morning, Saturday, May 15th, Tom Fortier is looking through the alleys in the 1600 block of Hickory, and he shines his light into the rear yard of 1690. And I remember what he described to me. Tom said he shined the light in and he saw what he thought was a large doll lying on the ground. And unfortunately, that large doll was Ljubica. He was taken aback. You think it's a doll, and then as you get closer, and you realize that no, this is not a doll. This is the 6-year-old girl that we've been looking for, and she's been very badly injured, severely beaten, like a very high level of violence and aggression. It was evident on scene that this was a sexually motivated crime. She was sexually assaulted. Part of her clothes were removed, and ultimately the cause of death was asphyxiation. The distance that she was from where she was taken was about 1 kilometer, and the time from when it was called into the police to the time that she was located was 4 hours.
At 1:20 a.m. on the 15th, we were picked up at the railroad tracks and taken to a location on Hickory Road, and learned that the little girl had been found deceased in the backyard off of the alley. It was dark. Lighting in the area where she was found wasn't the best. The streets have got lights, but the alleys don't. There were a lot of officers there, a lot of plainclothes detectives were there, and there was a cameraman there. There was an ident unit there.
When looking at the crime scene photographs, a lot of them were blurry. And the old policeman told me that the forensic officer that took the pictures had a huge family, he had 12 kids. And he was so affected by the scene that his hands were shaking. So you can imagine what the scene looked like.
We drove back to the precinct. It was pretty quiet. Being a young father at that time myself, it kind of struck home. We felt that we had done everything we could. We had got our own officers out as quick as we could, but unfortunately, it ended badly.
Right now we're standing at the corner of Drew Lard Road and Franklin. Drew Lard runs this way, and Franklin, if you look down that way, you can see what's left of the old Ford foundry, which was one of the biggest employers in the area in the 1970s. The Topic family's house was basically right in this area here. I believe it was the second one in. The scrapyard was around in the 70s. It was Paisner Scrapyard, but it's expanded now, and their house was torn down some time ago. There was an employee that worked at the gate at the Ford foundry, and he remembers looking through the window of his office and seeing somebody, a male, dressed in black, crouched down across the street outside the cafe. And he was looking towards where the kids were playing. He was described around 20 or early 20s or so.
The next 2, 3, 4 days a week, we were all looking for a tall, slim guy that wore dark clothing. It seemed like everybody was tall, dark, white male and wearing dark clothing. The description was not odd, put it that way. It was very close to a lot of people. And so we were jumping on anything we could because we wanted to get this taken care of and solved.
We have had many calls come in this weekend, and as a matter of fact, we have interviewed as many as 38 people as of yesterday.
Anytime that we came across anyone like that even kind of remotely looked like it might be, we would talk to them, get their information, and submit it to the investigating detectives. That happened quite a bit over the next days and weeks. But it seemed like it came to a dead end.
We'd written stories over time, just updates, police still looking for the killer, we want tips, there's the rewards. I think very quickly in like 1971, there was like an $11,000 reward, which it's huge at the time, right?
Our best witness is Michael. The information that he provided is the information that seemed to be the genesis of a suspect or person of interest profile. A very early composite. It was done by a person I don't think had any forensic training when it comes to creating composites. But he sat down with Michael and they drew up a simple sketch. It didn't have a ton of detail to it. A white male with a thin face. There's suggestions of potentially light brown to straw blonde hair. But steps taken in the 1970s out of desperation, like we need to find this person. Like they recognize the need to find this person. You're trying to get a description out of an 8-year-old boy who's your best witness, presenting them lineups of people who looks like the person. And I feel bad for Michael because of how much he was put through with this, paraded through so many lineups. Just please show us somebody who looked like the person who took your sister. I can't imagine the amount of trauma that poor boy went through trying to identify the person responsible. I can't imagine. There was very limited other information. We uncovered a report where there was a neighbor said she observed Ljubica walking with an individual a few blocks away, like in between where she was abducted and where she was found. Not a whole lot of information was gleaned from that. There were kids that were playing in the area, but they never saw anybody actually walk off with her.
I think everybody figured that it was a stranger to town. It was very unusual, and it was shocking at the time. It is something that not normally happens here.
When this happened in 1971, it was a level of fear in this city that people who grew up at that time still remember it. Like, it was completely different. Their lives changed. Everybody was on high alert, where this person, this phantom, has come and taken a child and done something horrific to them. And we don't know who they are.
Welcome back to Crime Beat. The murder of 6-year-old Ljubica Topic devastated her family and left Windsor residents shocked, enraged, and fearful. Now, everyone wanted the culprit found, of course, but 20 years later, police were still searching for her killer. We now return to a million dead ends.
You can see, based on the amount of reports that are coming in from 1971 to about 1973, they put a lot of work into this case. Forensics in the 70s was limited to hair fiber analysis, to footprints, to fingerprints.
Really, the only tests available at that time were for blood identification, semen identification, and potential hair identification.
Obviously, we have her clothing, and there were things like sticks and bushes that were actually seized from the area. She had a tooth broken out, and there was a thread with blood on it.
Intimate items that came from the victim herself that were collected at autopsy. They were examined for the presence of semen. And there were various hairs that were looked at to determine what type of hair they were, but not necessarily being able to source them. You could identify that there may have been blood present, but not who it might have come from. There was a pubic hair present on some of the items collected from the victim, and that's what was used going forward to be able to forensically assist the investigation. This particular case underwent some of the early DNA testing that took place in the mid to late 90s. We were able to develop a DNA profile from that pubic hair, and that's what was used going forward to be able to compare individuals and eliminate them as the source of that.
So we develop a profile in the 1990s of who we think is responsible for this crime. And that's when Ken Luxford and Glenn Hardstone dig back into this case.
When we went to visit Ljubica's mother, she had a shrine on her mantle in her apartment with her picture of her daughter and candles and the cross. And that's 20 years after the fact. Just seeing the shrine and talking to her, you could feel that she was hurting, very hurting. She was concerned that we'd given up, and I reassured her that we never give up. We looked at all the evidence that we had, and in the file there was already a suspect that was being developed. He looked like the composer. We spoke to his common-law wife at the time. The family had thought he'd done it. She had a grandmother that lived in the area of the alley where the body was found. So there was a connection with him being there. Looking at his criminal records past, we noticed that he was always involved with younger girls, sexual assaults, and the trail had gone from Windsor to Toronto to Winnipeg. In Winnipeg, apparently there was a sexual assault, and he did time there, and then after that he went to Vancouver, where he eventually stabbed the girl that he was living with, and he was doing time in prison. This guy is a good suspect, and we just needed the DNA to match to prove it. I went to Abbotsford, BC, with a forensic officer, and we got his DNA. That was submitted to the forensic science people. Then it come back, there was no match.
It's one of these many times in this case where you're like, we finally got this, right? Especially once DNA comes around, where you have all these people, but now you know you got that smoking gun. If we get the DNA, we're gonna get him. So that's probably the first time where it's like, this is we're gonna get him, and it's not him. So the case kind of goes back on the shelf at that point. The lead is closed, and it sits for a few years until 2004, when Kent McMillan picks it back up.
It was hard to sift through police reports that were 40 years old, and the evidence, and tracking down people, finding persons of interest that really fit the bill. There was just so many tips. Some retired detectives would call with one. They would talk to a neighbor or a friend or an acquaintance, and somebody would mention something during the course of conversation. At odd times, the media would put out a story on Ljubica, and then the phones would start ringing. You go back into the old files and try to match them up. In the statements that we reviewed, the brother was told to play for a while the abductor took Ljubica away. But he immediately went into the house, informed his mother and aunt, who immediately came out of the house, headed southbound on Drouillard to Seminole Street, which is the first main crossing there. By that time, Ljubica was not in sight, so we figured it made sense that he cut west, either through a house or on Metcalf Street to the first alley, stayed in the alley, then cut over to Hickory when he thought it was safe. We're currently in the 1600 block of Hickory Road, and behind me approximately, we had a witness sitting on his front porch, witnessed the suspect dragging a young girl who was crying southbound on the sidewalk. He went in to grab a cold drink. When he came out, he looked for them. He looked north and south, and when he looked south, they were already gone. So we figured that the suspect took her into the rear of the house where she was found. The fact that the mother and the aunt had walked all that way and had not seen Ljubica, and surmising the whole time that the abductor and Ljubica were paralleling them southbound at the same time is the tragedy of the whole thing. This was always a DNA case. That's all we had as evidence. In 2004, we resubmitted all the clothing from the victim up to the Center of Forensic Sciences.
You'll recall that we did have a DNA profile from the pubic hair, late 90s, but it was one item. By the time the mid-2000s came, we had that same DNA profile in many locations on the victim's clothing where there was blood present. It gives you that confidence that you're dealing with the target profile, that this might be the DNA profile from the individual who might be responsible for this particular event.
We had quite a few leads that we had to work on. One of the most suspicious but promising was from a lady who lived in Northern Ontario. She had been sexually molested by her brother, who now resided in Toronto. He had a record for sexual assault, kidnapping. I received another phone call that stated he was a resident on an address in Assumption Street in Windsor, maybe a 25-minute walk from Drouillard Road where Ljubica was living. Eventually he was excluded. There was a family in town here who, the whole family of career criminals, involved in drugs, theft. We received a tip that the father of this clan had molested this person when they were young, but he had since passed away. So we had to get familial DNA. He was excluded. Some people we just approached and told them what we were investigating, and they agreed to give us a blood sample. Other times I would have to use search warrants to get the blood samples from hospitals, clinics, dentist offices. You would have some very good leads. They lived in the neighborhood, they knew the family, they had criminal records with sexual assault and kidnapping, they had, violent streaks. But in the end, they were all excluded. We excluded close to 30 people. During the time of submitting blood samples, I was advised by the center that they were running out of comparative samples. I arranged for a meeting up at the center, And I begged that they go over it one more time. And thank God they found more samples of semen on the clothing and that they were suitable for comparison. So it gave us more hope that we're going to be able to solve this.
I moved here as a reporter in 2006, and almost immediately, especially because I was doing the crime beat a lot, people would, ask me like, "Oh, so you know about Ljubica," or "What do you know about Ljubica?" Right? It was always this thing that was in the ether of the city. It really bled into the fabric. People still talk about it. People who were kids remember not really understanding why, but all of a sudden they couldn't go out to play, or their parents were locking the doors at night. They remember that very distinctly. As I was writing it over the years, I would get phone calls or emails or letters about people like, "Oh, I remember that, and I still think about it." And they didn't even know her, but it was this horrific case that just stuck in the collective consciousness of the city. I landed an interview with Ljubica Topic, Ljubica's mother, and it was the first time ever in 40 years that she'd talked publicly about it. That interview was heartbreaking. It was clear that this incident had just punched a hole in that family. It cratered that family. And she lived with it every day of her life. She talked about still dreaming about her. She had a photo. She would walk by and still speak to her little girl that had died 44 years ago. And it was like, for her, it had happened yesterday. She not only thought about her daughter, but she thought about the killer. Obviously, she wondered who this person was, but she talked about just being sad all the time. And she hoped that maybe the killer was living with that as well. She said, how could somebody do that and it not weigh on them somehow? And at the same time, the police, for the first time ever, announced that they had found this man's tooth at the scene of the crime. First time in 44 years, they had made this announcement, hoping to breathe life back into this case.
There were teeth found at the scene that would match a male suspect between the ages of 16 and 20. It's my opinion that at the scene, when she was taken to the rear of 1690 Hickory, that she fought. She fought quite violently, and I know she had a pair of hard-soled shoes, penny loafers on, probably kicked him in the mouth, which would result in losing the tooth, and then he reciprocated with some very violent actions towards her. And just thinking of her, those last moments fighting for her life, pretty bad.
When I picked up the case in 2014, there was a rush to get this case done, given the age. Because the age of the case, the person that we think is responsible was around 20. Well, they're getting up there now too, and there's an increased chance that this person is also now deceased. We actually have over 700 persons of interest for a variety of different reasons. If you have 700 persons of interest, how many do you really have? You don't have any, you don't have any focus, because there's so many different things that you have to go through to eliminate. When we tested the vaginal swab in 2015, we located an evidence. It had never been tested. The seal was still intact from 1971. Comes back to the exact same profile. We put it onto databases. I sent it to the United States and had it compared to American databases. I sent it to Europe to have it compared there, and hoping for a hit, and it never registered a hit anywhere. So now we keep going for persons of interest. You come across these people that look like very interesting suspects, but they've been deceased. It was dead end after dead end after dead end, and some of them were so exciting, this has to be the right person. I can tell you that we eliminated at least 50 to 60 people by DNA. So around 2016, we ended up sending some of our raw DNA down to a lab in the States to have it processed to get some phenotypings, which gives you probability predictors for things like hair color, eye color, freckling. You can potentially infer where their ancestral heritage might have come from in the world, things like that. When we get the phenotyping back, we learned that this person was very highly likely to have just had brown hair, was likely to have little to no freckling, and I think the heritage indicated more towards Scotland and Northern Europe. So what we did is we had a composite done up from what the person may have looked like in 1971, and another one, what they could look like now. We actually released those to the public. Is this triggering anybody? No leads were ever developed, and it just seems to be another dead end.
The Golden State Killer case went unsolved for 43 years.
So in 2018, Golden State Killer has just broken, and they've used investigative genetic genealogy. There are a variety of different ancestry type databases in the United States where you can upload your DNA and you discover people who share DNA with you.
The way investigative genetic genealogy works is you take the suspect's DNA and you put it onto a public website and you get matches back, which means that those people are genetically matched with the suspect. And so if you build those people's family trees, the suspect will be on their family trees. It'll show how many centimorgans the match shares with the suspect's DNA. And the higher the centimorgans, the closer the relationship. And so you can estimate that the person might be a second cousin to third cousin, or fourth cousin to third cousin once removed.
When that kit gets set up, we do come back with 4 people that shared some DNA. There was more to varying degrees, but you could see different levels of shared centimorgans between these individuals and the person who killed Ljubica. So now we want to find out more about these people and build family trees around their families.
If they're, let's say, a second cousin, you have to build at least 3 generations up and then come down 3 generations. So there's a lot of people to look through. We eventually came down to 2 suspects that lived in Windsor, 2 blocks from the scene, approximately the right age, and genetically looked like it would be in the right level on the family tree chart.
One of them comes up on our massive person of interest list from 1971. So immediately the focus becomes, let's get DNA from these guys. And after 2 or 3 months, we were able to obtain a sample from at least the one brother, the one that was, his name was listed in the box. And I thought, we're done. And when we get the CFS report back, he is excluded. It is not him. In June of 2019, I was fortunate to meet Steve Kramer, who was with the FBI at the time, and worked on the Golden State Killer case. He facilitated getting our DNA profile onto Family Tree DNA. We're the first Canadian law enforcement kit that Family Tree DNA accepted. And I remember I was actually out for a jog, and my phone goes, it's the day or 2 after we've uploaded it, and it's Steve Kramer. He's already looked at our kit. He says, hey, you've got a second cousin.
I'm in heaven. I mean, a second cousin, it's like, this is awesome. And it turns out that his grandmother's brother was married to someone else in the tree. So now we know it's a descendant of this couple.
They had a son and a daughter. The daughter had one son who lived in Windsor at the time, still lives in Windsor, but based on lifestyle, really didn't expect this person to be the person responsible. The son from that intersection had 3 boys. So when you look at it, we have 5 people, including the father of the 3 boys, that could have potentially committed this crime. There are 3 of those individuals that are living. 2 of them are deceased. One of the 3 brothers actually had died in the previous year or so while we were investigating this. So I was fortunate because the focus we have was 2 individuals. One was this deceased brother, and the other was his half-brother. Based on what I was seeing with that half-brother and some of his known police contacts and sort of the similarity of some of the acts that he did compared to what we're seeing in this case, I thought it's going to be this person, right? Our surveillance team working on this person in another jurisdiction was able to get a sample from him, and the comparison comes back and it's not him. His DNA does not match. He is not the person responsible, so it's just wind out of the sails. I ended up contacting the rest home that the other brother who was in, Alberta, and we determined that there was still a medical sample. I wrote a warrant to obtain that sample. It was obtained and brought back here to Windsor from Alberta.
In late 2019, we received a lung tissue sample that was in paraffin-embedded block, which we can sometimes work with and get DNA from, and that's what was submitted to us.
I have a great relationship with the CFS biologist who worked on this case with me. One thing I know about Melinda is she gets there fairly early. I think she gets there about 6 o'clock in the morning. She leaves early in the afternoon. So if I send her an email late in the afternoon, She's not going to get it, but at 6:01 the next day, I'm going to have a response. After I collect myself after seeing that the one half brother is not responsible for it, I said I'm going to send her an email and just say, hey, just following up on that other sample, the tissue sample, we haven't heard back yet. And I get a bounce back reply from her email saying she's out of office, will return on Monday.
Welcome back to Crime Beat. After nearly 5 decades, 700 suspects, and countless dead ends, police think they found Ljubica's killer. But will the DNA results prove them right this time? Here now is the conclusion of a million dead ends.
That particular morning, it was December 9th, it was a Monday, so I came in as I usually do. You grab everything out of your mailbox, and I realized, oh, the results are back from this case. This is great, let's take a look. We've had a number of comparison samples that were submitted to us over the years. This particular one was unique in that it was a biopsy sample. Often we'll typically get reference samples from people who are living, so it may be a blood sample or a buccal sample, but to get a lung tissue sample is not typical. It's a bit unusual, and so it sort of piques your interest. I look at these papers and my breath got taken away. You look at them and you think, oh my God. And because I'm an early bird, there's nobody else around, and I'm the only one that knows. And then I have the email from Scott sitting in my inbox, and I can't tell him.
I worked an afternoon shift in major crime that night. I got home. By the time I got up in the morning, it's 11 o'clock. So I checked my email, and I have nothing from her. And that's really unusual because she's really good at getting back to you.
We always have to get everything checked to make sure that it is sound and that I'm releasing reliable results. Being able to finally email him back and say, can I call you? With no answer to his question, just can I call you? That's when your heart starts racing.
I still remember I'm sitting on my couch, 12:30, phone rings, it's Melinda. And I remember her saying, like, are you sitting down? And she says, yeah, this is a match.
All those profiles you've been generating since the mid-90s, and they're the same. This matches.
A wave of emotion hits me. I've been working this for 5 years. Kent McMillan, 8 years. Luxford and Hartstone put a couple years on this. All these guys, dating back to 1971, who have carried this case on. And for the first time in 48 years, you've identified the person, which is what you wanted. But now it's all these extra steps like, okay, we've got to let the family know. And you pull up in front of the house and you know the family's all waiting in there and like, oh my God. Paula absolutely understood what I was telling her. It's not happiness because it's still the death of Ljubica, but the fact that there's finally some resolution, there's a relief in that family that it was not somebody that they knew.
Over the past 48 years, we've continued to search for answers in this case. As of Monday, December 9th, 2019, that search is now over.
It was a very emotional press conference. The detectives that had worked on it, even in the last few years, there was ones there that were right from the beginning. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. You could tell those officers, it meant a lot to them. And several of them said, like, this is the defining moment of my career. We got a lot of letters saying, like, I've always wondered, thank God they finally found out who did this. I'm just glad this person's not still out there. I knew Ljubica when I was in kindergarten. I visited her grave over the years, and I just always wondered, and I'm just so glad this was finally solved. So at that press conference, the police said they have solved the case. We know exactly who it was. This man moved somewhere out west after the crime, and that's it. It irked me. So they made this big show about, after all this time, finally solving this case. We know who it was, closure for the family, closure for the community, except there wasn't closure because they refused to say who it was. They claimed it was a privacy issue because this man had died, and they wouldn't even tell us when he had died. Their argument was, since he's dead, they cannot officially charge him. And since they can't charge him, they can't release his name because it would violate his right to privacy. Their claim was that a dead person has a right to privacy 30 years after their death. First of all, they had released names of dead suspects in the past, as of many other police forces. So it just didn't hold water for me. So we did several stories. We talked to experts. We wrote columns saying this doesn't make any sense. It's a general consensus, I think, that you can't libel a dead person. So that was one issue we had. The other one was like, it's only right that after all this time, the community should have closure too. And the third issue we had was, like, what other crimes out there that could this help with? Like, there might be a cold case out west where he moved. You know, there might have been some in Windsor. We don't know. There's no way to know unless you put it out there. So we didn't let it go. The next step was a Freedom of Information request. We asked for the identity of the killer, his age at the time, you know, did he know the family, where he lived in proximity to the family, and where did he go out west when he moved? And are you aware of any other crimes that he might have done? Denied. Police wouldn't give it to us. We appealed, denied again. So we appealed it to the Privacy Commission. And that began more than a 3-year process of us fighting with them to get it. And then late one night, I was sitting at home and I got an email from the Windsor Police privacy people saying, after correspondence from the Privacy Commission and after a new look at this from new police management, here it is. So I found out that the killer's name was Frank Arthur Hall. He was 22, an unemployed laborer at the time, I believe. And he lived just down the street from this family. I think they lived in the 1200 block of Drouillard Road, and he was in the 1800 block.
He was from Windsor. He had some minor criminal contacts with Windsor Police Service before, and some afterwards. Nothing of significant eye-catching nature that you would look at this person and say, oh wow, look at that. I found his contact card, and I could see that in May of 1971, his address changed to 1817 Drouillard Road, which is 6 blocks from the abduction point and about 2 blocks from where she was murdered. He did end up migrating out west, and he lived in Edmonton for the remainder of his days. He raised children after that, and actually that was the next chapter in this case, because a few years later we decided we were going to release the name. We had to let his daughters know. Now I've got to go out and tell them, like, some pretty horrific news about their father. And I've never seen two people absorb that type of news as well as these two did. Yeah, very impressed with them.
The Windsor Police did say that it was 2 parts, new management having another look at it, and the Windsor Star fighting for it for so long that they finally decided to release it. It was nice to at least acknowledge that it was related somehow to this battle we went through.
When you finally hear that the case has been solved and you hear the name, what did you think?
I never heard the name before. That name was not in the box.
When I received the word that they had found him, it was a real satisfying day.
Probably the crowning moment of my career to actually get to that point. And I think it's a crowning moment for this police service to be able to preserve that evidence and just pursue this until it was finally finished after almost 50 years.
Like from day one, with the officers on the scene, with the forensic officers, and all the officers all along, it's like, this is the culmination of everybody's hard work. And why did we do this? For the family. Worth every second I put in.
You know, you have this picture of this young girl walking away, holding hands with this monster who's about to take her life, and her brother kind of watching, not really understanding what was happening. I think that was one of the things that really struck a chord with people, was that, like, that kind of thing never happened in Windsor before, but now it happened, and like, it could happen to anybody. That could happen to my kid, or that could happen to your kid. And so that was a scary thought for a lot of people. It made them more concerned about their neighbor. Like, you know, we look out for our neighbor a little more, maybe.
They never forgot. That was the thing. They never forgot that little girl. And that made me feel good, because she shouldn't have been forgotten.
Though Ljubica's family declined to speak with us on camera for this episode, they did tell us about the shadow they lived under following her death. With Frank Hall dead, they will never know why. But they are immensely grateful to the Windsor Police Service for never giving up. In solving Ljubica's murder, They received the Linda Shaw Memorial Award for Cold Cases. I'm Anthony Robart. Thank you for joining us tonight on Crime Beat. Want more episodes of Crime Beat? Listen to the Crime Beat podcast now for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. And for past episodes of Crime Beat, go to the Global TV app, visit globaltv.com, or check out our Crime Beat YouTube page.